Hi there, Professor Dyer here, talking about research in human development and family science. How do scientists who do research on topics in HDFS protect the human rights of the subjects that they study? Clearly, it's important that the people who do scientific research in HDFS know about the ethical guidelines, but I would like to make the argument that it's also really important for people who read the results of those studies, who use the results of empirical research in HDFS in their jobs. It's important for those folks to understand how ethics works in research with human subjects, because those ethical guidelines shape the nature of the information that we have that is based on empirical evidence. A good place to start is with the Tuskegee syphilis study. This study was started in order to track the outcomes of syphilis infection. However, while the study was ongoing, science discovered that the disease could be treated, could in fact be cured. And they did not tell the subjects of the study this, so they exploited them for decades, continuing to study disease progression, but never offering treatment. How did they get away with that? Essentially, because they had selected a really vulnerable population. The study subjects were African American men in the rural South who lived in poverty. When the Tuskegee syphilis study was exposed by journalists, by the way, not by the scientific community itself, but when it was exposed by journalists, it created a bit of an uproar, as you might imagine. How was it possible that research subjects were treated in such a terrible manner? This gave rise to a lot of discussion about what is ethical in research with human subjects, and it gave rise to the guidelines that the U.S. federal government currently uses regarding ethical use of human subjects in scientific research. The Belmont Report is the document that was written to outline principles for ethical treatment of human subjects. Let's take these three principles one at a time and talk about how each principle changed the way research is done. The first one is respect for human persons. This obviously was not done in the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. Essentially, what comes out of the principle of respect for persons is informed consent. Research subjects have to know that they are in a study. They have to know exactly what the study will entail. They have to be informed about the risks and the benefits of the study. And having been informed, they must give their affirmative consent to participate. It's simply not allowed to trick people into participating when they don't know it. As part of informed consent, there are guidelines in terms of what subjects have to be told, what will happen, the risks and benefits, how they're going to be protected, how to get a hold of the scientists, and that they can drop out at any time. A few things that are specific to HDFS. One thing is, because we study a lot of children, you might wonder, well, can children give informed consent? That maybe they're not cognitively prepared to do that. No. Legal guardians, parents and legal guardians must offer informed consent before a child can be the subject of a study. But children must also assent, meaning they must not protest. Children's wishes have to be honored to some extent in this process as part of respect for persons. There are a couple of exceptions, times when informed consent is not necessary. One is when the behavior being studied is public and the participants are completely anonymous. So if a person is behaving in a public place and we observe them there and we don't know who they are, we're allowed to do that without getting their agreement. It's public behavior. And then the second time that informed consent is not necessary is when the scientist is using existing archival records that are also anonymous. The second principle in the Belmont Report is the principle of beneficence. Essentially, this means that we can't harm people. Research has to be done in a way that is good for people and does not harm them. This is sometimes a little tricky, and the line that has been drawn is that discomfort might be okay, but harm is something that would last beyond the experience of the research, and that is really not allowed. So we can't harm people. We can't put them at risk of harm when we study them. Often what this means in HDFS, and it's different in other fields, but in HDFS, often what this means is that we protect their privacy. We ask about things that are personal, that are intimate, that are inherently private, close interpersonal relationships. These are considered private, should be considered private. And so if we study these things, we work really hard to maintain privacy. Now, I do just want to alert you to two terms that you might encounter when you start thinking about privacy in human subjects. One is anonymity. Anonymity means the identity of the research subject is not known. The scientist does not even know that person's name or how to reach them or anything about them. That's anonymity. Confidentiality is when the scientist does, in fact, know their name and how to reach them, but they essentially promise to keep that information private, to not share it. Confidentiality is more common in research in HDFS than is anonymity. There are usually some limits to confidentiality. The big one in our field is that if we find out that someone is being harmed or is harming others, then confidentiality has to disappear. But for the most part, we can promise research subjects confidentiality, and it's a huge responsibility to maintain that, to make sure that their identity cannot be discovered by someone. The third thing about the principle of beneficence is that when a study is conducted for which there is the potential for some kind of harm, that study must be tracked, the subjects of the study must be tracked carefully so that harm can be stopped if it is identified early. The third principle is the principle of justice. And the main statement here is that the risks and the benefits of research must be equitably shared in the society. Now, if you recall the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, the risks of that research were being borne entirely by a vulnerable population. The risks were not shared by anyone else except those African American sharecroppers in the South. But the benefits of the research presumably would be shared by everyone in society, even people who didn't pay any of the price for getting that information. And so the principle of justice says that can't happen. On the one hand, we must go out of our way to protect vulnerable populations. I'll list them here in just a minute. And secondly, we must go out of our way to study diverse study samples so that nobody is sort of left out of the domain of research. If a population is not studied in research, then they cannot possibly benefit from research. That's not okay. This is one that in HDFS we need to work on. We tend to have a lot of research conducted in white middle-class families, and we get a lot of information from women in white middle-class families. And when we struggle with the diversity of our study samples, that is not ethical, and our discipline is working to change that, but we have to keep it forefront in our minds as scientists to diversify our study samples. The vulnerable populations that are especially protected, according to the Belmont Report, you can see them listed here. I've listed ones that are particularly related to HDFS. Children is the one we most frequently encounter. These populations, there are kind of special hoops to jump through before we can study any of these populations. The principle of justice in the Belmont Report established IRBs, which are institutional review boards. So before research with human subjects can occur, the scientist must get the approval of a review board constructed and run by whatever institution they're affiliated with. So universities have IRBs, hospitals have IRBs, institutions like that have IRBs, and the scientists must submit their research plan, demonstrate how they will protect the human subjects, and if there are any risks at all associated with the research, they must provide regular reports to update so that the potential for risk can be tracked, and that's what IRBs do.